Welcome to Coach, Practical Takeaways with Will Murtha and myself, Carrie Davis-Munro. Good morning, Will.
Good morning, Carrie. How are you?
I'm fantastic this morning. Thank you very much. So today we are delighted. This is our usual LinkedIn Live, our Wellbeing Wednesday at a slightly earlier time, but we're delighted to be streaming into Facebook and YouTube concurrently today. And today, Will and I are going to be discussing the link between perfectionism and addictive habits. So we've talked about perfectionism before, Will, but I think it's really important for us before we go on to really deep dive, and we've just had a chat, we could be talking about this for hours. This is something that comes up with our clients a lot, isn't it? And I know you and I have both coached around both perfectionism and addiction so much over the last 2 years. But I think it's important for us to get a sort of definition around what perfectionism is before we start, because it means different things to different people, doesn't it?
I think, it's a great example. What would people do years ago if they were doing a live broadcast? The dog barks, they'd cut the broadcast because it's not perfect. So there's a great example.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know what she saw, so my apologies there.
But seriously, I think with addiction, we've all got this ability to try and put everything up to society's gloss that everything's got to be great. I mean, perfectionism is different things to different people. I think there's a simple almost 30 years, I think 1991, there was two psychologists, Hewitt and Flett, and they deciphered that there's three types of perfectionism. I think this is a great place to start and come in at, is that there's number one, which is self-directed. So what we mean by that is our inner critic goes mad. We are constantly beating ourselves up emotionally from the inside because we're self-directing that self-perfectionism and we're never good enough for ourselves. Number two was almost the reverse of that. So it's what they called, I think, other orientated, which really means that, when we're in that perfectionist mindset, we're always blaming other people in our team, in our family, for not being as perfect as we would like to be ourselves. It's a form of projection, in psychology, in effect. And then the third one was that, this social pressure that we have, we feel this pressure from the outside world to be perfect. I get this problem a lot with the influencers, and TV people that high performers that I coach, like we were talking about earlier, because, they set their bar, their standards so high that, if someone from the outside is deemed in their mind to be judging them, FOPO, fear of other people's opinions, we've talked about many times before, people pleasing, that number three is a really important one, because so much of our perfectionism is actually driven by outside social forces that we deem are affecting our life. And like someone once said to me, one of my mentors, other people are not thinking about you as much as you think they are. I think that's a great start.
Exactly. The ego plays a massive part in this whole thing, doesn't it, when we talk about perfectionism? So it's important to note. So let's get down to the grassroots. What is perfectionism? It's the action or process of improving something or someone until they are flawless, perfect. Well, immediately we know that we can't have perfection. Free from fault or defect. A person striving for flawlessness, high standards, exacting self-treatment and critical self-evaluation. So the biggest problem here that, I see is that people that come to us, and they don't necessarily know it, they might come to me with a problem that they're overeating, or they might come with a problem that they're drinking too much, or they're losing money because they're playing the stock market or whatever. But the belief here is that they are only worthy and feel enough if they are high achieving, they are winning, and they are constantly successful. And it is not reality. We cannot be doing this all the time. So let's have a look, Will, where it shows up in common signs, and really why this has happened. But let's look at some common signs first of all for you in terms of where it shows up. What do you see?
I mean, just, this is where it shows up as examples. So, it's the compulsion, isn't it, to always be right. It's self-defeating thought patterns in effect. We're spending far too much time, energy, emotion, effort on trying to get a task right, picture perfect. You know, where does it other places it shows up? A writing project. So, you know, if I'm doing a project, and I'm giving my own examples and also my clients' examples here, you know, when I've talked to them and coached them and looked at my own life, you know, writing projects or any other project that we're working on, we can spend far too much time, far too much effort, and we haven't got it in perspective. We're obsessional about it. A prep is a big one for a talk. Like, you know, we know that one of the number one fears for people is public speaking. And in the early days when I'm coaching people, especially a CEO, or I mean, obviously the TV and influencers are okay on this area, but if I'm coaching a CEO of a big corporate, there's an expectation that they're going to be a great orator, a great speaker when they, especially with the Zoom that we've gone through the last few years, a lot of panic attacks from some of my CEOs and MDs around the world because they were expected to deliver these really pitch perfect, you know, presentations, and they really didn't have it in them. So we would be coaching for months on presentations, you know,
And
getting ready.
It's interesting, Will, because at the other end of that, obviously, is what people think of them. You know, what he's
FOPO.
ultimately worried about and why he's afraid to stand up is, you know, what are people going to think of me? Will I get this as good as I want to? That's the fear, isn't it? You know,
That's the FOPO. That's the FOPO.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
fear of other people's opinions, that I'm not
yeah,
going to be good enough, which feeds into the perfectionism inside of us.
yeah,
I think the biggest one for me, excessive plan is another one, by the way.
yeah.
But the biggest one for me the last few years is writing. And I'm looking at my own life and my clients' lives in that if you are going to write a book, which is one of the hardest things to do, you know, especially when you're looking from a personal perspective point of view, I don't care who someone is, whether they're 100 million, 50 million book bestseller around the world. They've always talked about the making sure they get their ego in place. You know, it's not riding over them, sort of, you know, and taking them over. Because, you know, writing a book and getting your inner world out
Yeah.
there is probably one of the hardest tests that your perfectionism is going to have. And, you know, because you're never going to finish it. It's like a bottomless pit. And I think what you have to do, we're going to talk about, you know, remedies and ways that what we can do later. But I think the writing the book thing is the best example of where perfectionism shows up and the damage that it can do. I mean, literally, you know, you're looking at self-esteem, you're looking at your worth issues, you know, health issues, you know, relationship struggles. You know, this is the places that perfectionism is showing up. I mean, I've got friends and I know friends of friends, and they've not been with a partner for 5, 10, 20 years because their standards of perfectionism, of what they expect in a relationship, is so high and so perfect that in themselves and others, by the way, it's not just projection out, that they'll probably never end up getting a partner again.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I've got a couple of clients that, again, the fear of that partner not being good enough as well. You know, what if I meet somebody better? What if it could be better than that? And what if I go with that, but it could be better? I mean, this is all about perfectionism. And what if actually then I'm not good enough? You know, these questions are just debilitating, and they keep people where they are, and they stop them from really enjoying life. Interestingly enough, there's something that you said about planning. Again, I can give you an example that's happened this week. A client was having difficulty with journaling in general, so I recommended the 6-minute diary. I said, it's great, just 3 minutes in the morning, 3 minutes in the evening. Anyway, it's wonderful if you haven't seen it. It's got a fantastic intro that, you know, you can read through, and, you know, you can read through it before you start. Me, I delve in. My client is 3 months, it's sat on her desk because she hasn't read through all the bits and doesn't want to start until she's absolutely prepped. Done is better than perfect. Let's get going with this. Yeah, the work needs to start. So, you know, when you talked about planning there, that resonates with me. Some other common signs. You're a perfectionist if you're a perfectionist in all things. Usually it's not just work, it's making that cake, it's prepping that party, it's, you know, it's being a mum as well, or being a dad. And also you're an all or nothing person. You either do something full on or you don't do it at all because you're actually afraid. And then when you do go in, my God, it's got to be 100%. And perfectionists crave, as we said, this is why we get FOPO, they crave the approval and often feedback, which is our growth. We're going to talk about it. You know, we need feedback to learn, to grow. This is human. Perfectionists don't like feedback because they become defensive and, as you've said, highly critical of others, which can lead to procrastination, not having a relationship, and carrying guilt. So, Will, I want to ask you and talk a little bit about why this could have happened. How do we get to a point where we are this perfectionist, where we then, you know, it can lead on to habits to numb? And for me, the biggest one, and I want to get your take on this, is really society's norms and expectations of us as people, the jobs that we should do. And it starts for me again with our school systems, where we must come out with the best results, where everything is academic, where, you know, it's from the minute we go in really, you know, we start in year 2 or whatever it is, with the leading on to that final piece of paper when we leave school. That's where it starts, doesn't it?
I think perfectionism, you know, is that inner critic that we've allowed to go bonkers, isn't it? It's almost like we've built up such a fear of what the outside world thinks of us and believes in us, you know, that we don't like any form of criticism. You know, we don't like any sort of feedback. So this very much links into the whole Carol Dweck mindset philosophy, doesn't it? With a brilliant book, one of the best books if anyone wants to go out and understand mindset, because, you know, they talk about growth mindset, which would be a high performer, like sports people that I coach. You know, they've got a very good growth mindset, which means they invite in critical feedback because they know it's going to give them growth. You know, they've got humility. You know, their standards are rising, great, but they've got this desire to improve, but not at all obsessional causes. You know, they're not going to blame the outside world. You know, what you find with perfectionists, you know, per se, is that they will often, if they can't deal with their own stuff, they will often point the finger and blame it out at others. So that might be others in their team, others in their football club, others in their family, you know. And I think what we've got to do, you know, the reasons why this perfectionism grows, it's like any habit. You know, we've talked many, many times, Carrie, over the last several months about behavior change and habit change. It could well be that your perfectionism was forged from 4 or 5 years old, where you have an over-expectant mother or parent or father who really started to lay down the railway lines of making you perform in a certain way. Because, and interestingly, whenever I'm talking to people about perfectionism, and a client will talk to me about the inner critic, the voice of that inner critic, I will always ask them, who is it? And sometimes some will say it's a father figure, it's a mother figure, it's an auntie, it's a grandparent, it's a teacher, it's someone that I watch on television. You know, they can actually put that voice to a person. So this is where the programming was laid down, you know, why they don't now like to, why they're so easily able to create worst case scenarios in their mind as that inner critic, because they're basically not allowing any wiggle room for mistakes and failures, because, you know, they see mistakes and failures associated to their self-worth, their self-identity. So, of course, they don't want to make, you know, whereas most of us in a growth mindset know that mistakes and failure are actually imperative to your growth and development. They see mistakes and failures as a personal flaw that is to be avoided at all costs, to be papered over and not shown to the outside world. Literally, and I think this is true, that they have they've married their mistakes and any failures and flaws to literally their sense of self, their identity.
Yeah, Yeah. And it's really interesting for me because, you know, everything that we do is linked to our values. I always do a lot of work with clients around this on self-identity, self-actualization, and really values work, because we always say that it's really important to know your values, but know that your values haven't got you round the neck like a dog collar. Because I find that perfectionism is often linked to security. And obviously, we know that perfectionism is linked to control. And so this can often go back to something that's happened in your past where people, you know, where your world was out of control and where you looked to be achieving or to be, you know, to be successful in certain areas because that gave you your control. I mean, I recognize this in myself and I have to do a lot of work around that. You know, a childhood where at the age of 7 things seemed to me to be totally out of control. The adults, you know, weren't what they had been, and suddenly my control was to play sport all day every day, and I had to be the best and I had to succeed. But if we constantly then live our lives and feel our self-worth is linked to that achievement, oh my goodness, Will, it can be exhausting. It can lead to exhaustion. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue. It can lead to anxiety, shame, and it can lead to depression. And this is when the addictive habits, and for me, I guess, you know, this is interesting because you see this, it's a positive habit. I played sport till I dropped almost. Those addictive habits lead us to numb and cover over. And the trigger is, when we look at habits, the trigger is a lack of being perfect. And it's ironic that perfectionists don't even ask for help. They'll tend to go to extremes. If I can't do this properly, then I won't do it at all. Or, you know, I'll have someone who is trying to eat better, but actually, well, I can't. This tiny thing's gone wrong. So they press what they call, excuse my language, the F it button. Yeah. And then everything's just going to go. So life becomes out of control, the need to fix things quickly. And actually, you can't fix it quickly. Once you realize that this is a trait, and it is a trait, really. It's
addictive trait. Yeah.
It's a journey of lifelong self-awareness, isn't it? Sitting with the discomfort, learning that sort of acceptance. Yeah. Perfectionism is not real, and we don't learn from it.
You know, and also I love the term, and I've always called myself this. I mean, first of all, you shattered my illusion by telling me you're not perfect. My heart sank then. No, I mean, seriously, none of us are perfect, you know, and I'm talking about we coach between us. We coach a lot of top performers in various industries, you know, and I think what we've got to do is, you know, I've always got this term for myself, which I love to call myself perfectly imperfect. Because I think that's the great way. We have got our imperfections, we have got our flaws. You know, we're fabulously flawed, and we should be. And that's no matter how high we've climbed into our personal industry or career, because there's always somewhere else to go. We as having a growth mindset, we all believe that we can get better by incremental gains, don't we? That's the whole thing that drives us, is that, you know, and we're going to talk about the sports bit in a minute, because it's, you know, we've got to be very careful that we don't demonize perfectionism in some ways, because if we look at the top performers, and particularly the sports elite who we coach, you know, that perfectionism in a healthy way actually works for them and drives them to the pinnacle of their career. So, you know, we might not call it perfectionism. We almost could do with a different word for it. But, you know, that healthy perfectionism, where they know that they've got to develop their skills continuously, look at standards that they can keep rising, you know, have a deep inner intrinsic desire to improve. But the difference is they get great pleasure and joy out of self-improvement. And they are also have great humility. And, you know, they have a great mindset that invites in external criticism, and they actually will share and expose their flaws, and they will handle the criticism and critique well. There's the difference between good criticism, good perfectionism, and bad perfectionism.
Yeah. And let's not forget, when you say that obviously the environment, because we talk about this a lot, and I talk about this a lot with business leaders, the environment in which those learners are in will either lead to not necessarily bad, but the destructive self-perfectionism and talk and inner critic, or it will lead to the positive route that you've just talked about. And you were talking about footballers, so I don't know, I immediately go to Manchester United in the old days, and Ferguson, and the fire treatment. I don't know, I'm sure that really powered some up, but for others that would expose the need to cover up. I wasn't perfect, and the fear. And if we lead from a point of fear where we're not allowed to make mistakes, and I come right back to school and to business environments and everything, if we're not allowed in that environment to grow and to make those mistakes, then this is why we nurture, like a seed, this is why we nurture perfectionism, and it can become quite negative. So let's talk about what we can do. And I just want to kick this off before we talk about, and there's a number of things that we both do with clients. I want to talk a little bit about self-compassion. And I love, you had a great quote there from Brené Brown, and I was reading her again this week. She also talks about someone called Kristin Neff. And Kristin Neff talks about self-compassion being, the first point, really. When we've got this destructive perfectionism, we've got to come inwards. And she talks about there being 3 pillars. So firstly, we need to really favour self-kindness instead of self-judgment. Because perfectionism is all about judging yourself all the time, looking at how you are in comparison to others. So actually, we need to swap that. We need to flip it and be kind all the time. The kindness method is a great book too. And then this is probably more than anything else, this resonates with me. I don't know about you, Will, but she talks about common humanity versus isolation. And perfectionists see themselves as this sort of singular entity of me. I've got to be the best. The world will fall down if I don't do this. How will I be seen if? And actually, let's face it, Will, humanity is imperfect. We are, we couldn't be human if we were perfect. So it's about that us being part of something much bigger, isn't it? Which gives us a feeling of unity rather than what she calls isolation. And lastly, mindfulness, which we talk about all the time, and this is part of why we encourage journaling, but being aware of what's going on versus identification all the time, calling things out and really this self-demonizing all the time. And I think that those 3 pillars are absolutely wonderful. And obviously with that, Brené Brown says, lean into those tough emotions, but be aware and come back to self-compassion. And she calls that wholehearted living. So Will, if I was to say to you, what can we do? What would be some of the things that you would use with your clients?
So the first thing, I always remember a workshop, first thing that come to mind, and they took the word me and held it up against a mirror. And if you look at the word me in the mirror, it says we, which is brilliant, because what you just said was, we have to move out of this egotistical me attitude and actually take, holding all that weight of expectation, whether you're the captain of a club, whatever sports club that is, or an MP or a teacher, or someone in a global corporation, where you suddenly take all the pressure of the pandemic on your shoulders. What I noticed in the pandemic in the last 2 years is that people that struggled the most, the perfectionists, because they've obviously, lots of people, including you and me, have got perfectionist traits that we need to train and manage. We can't just throw them out, because they're the very things that's helped us become the people we are. So what I found in lockdown was that, and this was apparently happened a lot in sports. If you study the work of Don McPherson, Don coached Jimmy White and Pat Cash and George Ford, and many of the England rugby players, does a lot of golfers. He said that perfectionism came out a lot in lockdown because elite sports people didn't have their normal routine to take away all the different self-criticisms, self-loathing, and because they were, especially in isolation, you know, a lot of club players, people won't know this because it wasn't written about extensively, but a lot of club players in elite sports really suffered mental health issues
Wow.
because that perfectionist voice really started to you know, the inner critic started to tune up. And, you know, coming back to the point, I think where I start with a client is that if they are about to embark in a project, a talking, you know, presentation, or something that, you know, writing a book or whatever they're about to engage with, set themselves some boundaries, some self boundaries and self rules where to start first. So I will go, you know, I will get them to write down a set of, and I've just had one yesterday, which I've just written down here. And the one yesterday was a big events planner, and, you know, massive big jobs coming up this summer, bigger than, you know, she's ever had in her life. You know, amazing at her job, gifted, one of the best in the industry in this country. But we write these rules down. These are your life rules that you put in to remind yourself, like a mantra, every day. And it was that failure and mistakes are food. You need them and get the feedback from them. You know, feedback is good. You know, critical feedback is good. You know, don't sweat the small stuff. You know, don't allow yourself too much time on the small stuff that you just don't need to. Put it on the big things. So, you know, the whole timer thing I find is really interesting because, you know, I'll give an example. When I started writing my book, 3-4 years ago, the next book was coming out, I started to get over obsessed, because the thing is with psychology and coaching and self-improvement, personal development, is there's no bottom to it. You could just keep going and write a 5,000 page book, which is going to be quite heavy, like a brick. But, you know, so I had to get very specific with setting myself a time limit of how much time I am going to allow for certain topics and certain chapters, and then cut it off, because there is no bottom. There is no bottom to it. It's like a, you know, bottom of the ocean with no you know, bottom of the sea. So, you know, and the way to do that, which I've found that really works well with clients, particularly if they're doing a research project, particularly if they're doing any kind of task, is to do something called a PAB. And a PAB is a personal advisory bureau. It's literally what you do. You take a compass and you look at the north, east, south, west nodes, and you might say, for instance, give an example in research, you might say, right, I am going to research 4 particular people in this industry that are experts, specialists, you know, global masterminders in this field. I'm going to go north, east, south, west. And then when I've done 4, that's it. I'm going to write my paper. And what this does, it stops that because perfectionism will eat into your time. Like you said earlier, it will eat into your energy. It robs you your emotion, and that obsessional addictive quality will literally send your mind into a frenzy. So you've got to set yourself time for reflection. Am I being obsessive here? You know, time to analyze. Okay, this is where we've gone deep enough down the rabbit hole now. In my presentation skills, I'm never going to get it perfect, because what perfectionists sometimes forget is that some of the work is in the prep and some of the learning and growth is in the delivery, the application. I'll give a quick example before jumping off. You know, my daughter done 7 years at med school, you know, big group of Exeter Uni, big group of students. They got to the end of 7 years, and basically the consultants and teachers are going, right, off you go. This is where you're going to learn. And every one of those students said, I'm not ready. And their perfectionist brain kicked in, and they went, oh my God, I can't teach, you know, I can't be in a surgery now with real patients. And they said, we can only take you to a point of learning, and then the rest of your learning is on the job. And I think what we've got to do with that, we've got to separate perfectionism with how much do we take to the line of learning, and how much of the growth and development is going to come on while we're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, in that example there, we would just never get started, you know, especially when life depends on it, you know, in these situations. You'd never get started depending on what you had to lose. You know, I have to say that with a starting point, and we've looked at this before with, you know, with clients who are finding this quite debilitating, and therefore are numbing in a number of different ways, then my starting point is often with values and values elicitation, which is what we've talked about before, to understand which value has them, and to be able to notice that. And this is also a big part of understanding self-worth, because we've talked about personal philosophy before. But when we feel that we're acting in our truth, then I feel that, people, the self-awareness comes from part of that. And also another thing that I tend to do with clients, I have a number of clients, I can think of 3 that have been quite successful in the past, really successful, outstanding, I would say, in the past in their field. But what happens is that the next day or the next week, they feel that that's not them anymore. So they're losing self-worth. So something I tend to do with clients is an exercise to really celebrate, again, knock out the limiting beliefs and keep celebrating regularly, to advise them to look at their achievements. Because so many of the perfectionists that we work with are very high achievers. So it's about understanding the value, the self-worth, and 2 questions that I always say, ask yourself: what's the worst that can happen? Yeah, if I'm going to go and give this talk and I'm not 100% ready, or I feel I'm not, what's the worst that can happen? Yeah, this is what I call a reality check. What's the reality around that? Yeah, because when you realize, well, actually, the worst that can happen is I've forgot something, or it was 10 minutes shorter. The world's not going to end, because for perfectionists, we think that we are, omnipotent, and we think that we are indispensable. Actually, it's not. If it's not 100%, it doesn't matter to the world. It's not going to be the difference in the end of our world as well. So, what do I really have time for is another great question. And it's about the boundaries. What can I do here? What can I drop? Because actually, I can't do everything. And those 2 questions I find really good for perfectionists. And then, as usual, it's the physical stuff as well, because perfectionism is about control. Come back to what you can control. Get your structure, your anchors, what I call your scaffolding of habits that keep you going, that protect you, as it were, from falling into the negative habits that can sometimes be addictive and the numbing for perfectionists. So come back to the 3 things: you're sleeping, you're eating, and you're moving. And usually these will anchor you. I've mentioned the kindness method, but actually something that I love doing with clients is, you've said there, set the parameters, but also set yourself a mantra. And I advise them to set it themselves, but around always something I always say: I am valuable, because it is about, for perfectionists, what value you feel you have. I'm lovable, intelligent, attractive, capable. And above all, this comes back to the humanity. I succeed at life. And they might say to me, what do you mean I'm successful? Well, you're here, you're doing it. Yeah, life can be tough. You always say this, Will. Life throws the crap at us, but you're here, you're doing it. So you're succeeding. Recognize that. And accept others. We sometimes, as you said, we don't jump into relationships, or we're critical of others. We absolutely, all the things that we like to control as a perfectionist, we cannot control others. So our relationships may fail. They're meant to. We're meant to move through relationships, and and people we connect with at different times. But our friends and our connections are not an accomplishment. So note where people don't live up to your standards. Yeah. Be aware of the criticisms that you have of others. That's your second pillar, Will, that you talked about early on today. And finally, for me, and you've also, we touched on this earlier a little bit, in terms of being aware of measuring up. Please, perfectionists, limit your screen time and social media, because there is nowhere that perfectionism is so prevalent as on Instagram and TikTok and everything else.
Comparison. It's all about
It's
comparison.
that comparison, isn't it? Yeah. Do not get drawn into, am I as good as? Because it doesn't matter, does it, Will?
I love Johnny, just to sort of wrap it up, really. I think I love Johnny Wilkinson's quote that always sticks in my head. And he said, it's okay to strive to be number one. You're talking about one of the greatest England rugby players ever. It's okay to strive to be number one, but it doesn't make you anyone. And humility. If you look at Don McPherson talks about this a lot. He coached Senna and lots of other top elite sports. The one defining characteristic he noticed in these guys and women that were striving for the perfect version of themselves is that they still had grounded humility. And I think we have to remember that, because they don't beat themselves up. They set a standard and a bar, and then they won't beat themselves up. They still have a lot of joy getting there. That's the difference between someone that is never happy with themselves or, happy with other people.
Yes, it's so funny you say that, Will. Last night I was saying to them here, I said, what's the word when you have self-acceptance and you're humble and they were saying self-acceptance, humble. I said, no, there's another word. And you said it. So I'd have had a better night's sleep last night if you just said that before. It's humility. Perfectionism is all around that humility. Those two questions that I said, what do I really have time for and what's the worst that can happen? It's about humility. The world's not going to stop if you don't do this. And it's not all dependent, is it? So, let's lean in. The fundamental is let's lean into the pleasure and the joy and the learning, not the pain and the suffering around this. And life would be a lot easier. Yeah. Will, thank you so much. We've gone way over time. Such a massive topic. We try and keep to within half an hour. We usually do. We'd love to have your thoughts on this. We'd love to know where you sit on this scale of perfectionism. Are you towards the positive end that we would say is the growth mindset of perfectionism? Have you been working on it? Or are you here where it's quite destructive? We would always love to hear your thoughts. Contact us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. Will and I are always up for a chat and to hear how this lands with you. Will, thank you so much. We will be back next week, same time, and streaming in 3 places.
See you next week, Carrie. Take care.
Thank you all.